Hi, everybody. I'm Aaron Ettinger. I'm a professor in the Department of Political Science here at Carleton University, and I am going to react to Mark Carney's speech at Davos from January of 2026.
We're doing something else. To help solve global problems, we're pursuing variable geometry. In other words, different coalitions for different issues based on common values and interests.
Variable geometry. I heard this and I thought, oh my God, I got to get out my protractor and compass from high school math. Variable geometry is a really interesting phrase coming from Mark Carney. It seems high-minded and sophisticated, but to me it means we're not working through the formal institutions of world politics anymore. Right? We're not going to work through the UN just because it's the UN or NATO just because it's NATO, but instead he says we're going to pursue these kind of flexible coalitions. And that's a real sea change in Canadian foreign policy. And why is that? Well, for the last 75 or 80 years, Canada has sought to work through these formal institutions of world politics. Now with this variable geometry, well, we don't really know what that means, but we're going to find out.
Principled in our commitment to fundamental values, sovereignty, territorial integrity, the prohibition of the use of force except when consistent with the UN Charter, and respect for human rights.
This is really interesting, largely because of what's not included in his statement, right? So he talks about the principles and values of sovereignty and territorial integrity. These are old school principles of world politics from the 19th century and is a big change from the conventional post-Cold War attitude that Canada has taken in its foreign policy, right? And what did it do in the post-Cold War era? It pursued things like democracy promotion, yes, human rights, and Carney gestured towards that. But so much of this soft stuff that has been a part of Canada's foreign policy for the past 30 or 35 years seems to be taking a back seat to the hard considerations of territorial integrity and sovereignty.
We're just relying on the strength of our values, but also the value of our strength.
The strength of our values and the values of our strength. That is a very nifty inversion of a Canadian foreign policy formulation that's been around for the past 30 years. Right? Prime ministers since at least the end of the Cold War have talked about how Canada is a sort of moral superpower and how our values of democracy and multiculturalism and so on are our strength on the world stage. But by flipping it around, Mark Carney is suggesting that the hard power considerations of Canada's foreign policy might need to take precedence over the soft stuff. Mark Carney got huge props for his speech at Davos because he seemed to be telling it like it is, right? Maybe he's the new leader of the resistance against Donald Trump. But whatever the case may be, Mark Carney's vision of the future has a problem. And the problem is that the new order of things that he's envisioning, this variable geometry, is going to exist alongside the old order. The old order is not dead and gone. It's still around, and in some ways it's really popular. Right? The United Nations and NATO and all of these other organizations and institutions that make up world politics are still up and running. Right? The norms of cooperation are still very deeply held. So my question is, how do you build a new order on top of an existing order? Right? This variable geometry is going to result in some very awkward angles. Since Carney's Davos speech, a bunch of people have asked me what I thought about it, and my answer was, this is probably the most important speech by a Canadian Prime Minister since the 1930s. To appreciate that, let's go back in time. Let's go back to 1938. That's an important moment in Canada's foreign policy history. And why? Well, that was the moment, that was the year when Canada and the United States really began solidifying their patterns of cooperation. So let's go back to August 1938 in Kingston, Ontario. Right? President Franklin Delano Roosevelt is giving a convocation address at Queen's University, and he stands up there and he says, America will not stand idly by if domination of Canadian soil is threatened by another empire. Right? That's FDR saying, Canada, we have your back. Now, 2 days later, in Woodbridge, Ontario, Prime Minister Mackenzie King stands up and he says, we too have our obligations as a good and friendly neighbor. And one of them is to see that at our own instance, our country is made immune from attack or possible invasion as we can reasonably be expected to make it, and that should the occasion ever arise, enemy forces should not be able to pursue their way either by land, sea, or air to the United States across Canadian territory. That is Canada saying, you got our back, we got yours. And from there, Canada and the United States came to the Ogdensburg Agreement to set up the Permanent Joint Board of Defense, and that would set the pattern for Canada-U.S. cooperation for the next 80 years. Now, let's fast forward to 2017, right? June 2017, we have another signal moment in Canadian foreign policy history. Now, this is coming a day or so after Donald Trump withdrew the United States from the Paris Climate Agreement. And when the House of Commons, then Global Affairs Minister Chrystia Freeland, stood up and affirmed Canada's long-standing commitment to the rules-based international order. And here's what she said. The fact that our friend and ally has come to question the very worth of its mantle of global leadership puts the need for the rest of us to set our own clear, sovereign course. For Canada, that course must be the renewal and indeed the strengthening of the post-war international order. Wow. Okay, so 1938, Canada and the U.S. get together for real. 2017, even in the midst of the Trump disruptions, Canada is going to stand by the liberal international order. Then comes Mark Carney's rupture speech, his talk of variable geometries and multilateral organizations and multilateral coalitions of the willing. Right? This comes at the end of about a year of Mark Carney preparing us for this. Think about it. Back in March of 2025, shortly after he became the prime minister, he said that the decades-long process of an ever closer economic relationship between Canada and the United States is now over. It is now over. Then, of course, at Davos, he gives the rupture speech. He says that continuing to play within the rules-based international order is living within a lie. Hop, skip, and jump across history from 1938 to 2017 to 2026, and we can see major shifts in Canada's foreign policy orientation. So where do we go from here? Right? What does the rest of 2026, 2027 look like? The short answer is, I don't know and nobody else knows. But we do know that we are on the cusp of something new. Right? The old order is still around. Carney's variable geometry might be put into practice. We don't know what's going to come next, but that variable geometry is about to get awkward. All right, if you like this video, or if you don't like it, I don't care really, remember to like and subscribe and all that good stuff, and maybe I'll come back and have some more things to say.